Welcome to Geekstorians, the show that digs into the strange machinery of geek culture. The industrial logic, the creative chaos, the moments where the whole thing nearly didn't happen, and the even stranger fact that it happened anyway. I'm Dave from Geektown. Season 2 has been tracing a single idea. That the things we love rarely survived because they were managed well. They survived because people refused to let them disappear. Today is a different kind of story. Today we're not talking about a thing that almost died. We're talking about things that did fail. Publicly, commercially, sometimes humiliatingly. But then went somewhere nobody planned for. They found the people who needed it. And in their hands, it became something permanent. 3 films, 3 decades, 3 different species of commercial disappointment. And between them, they taught the entertainment industry a lesson it still seems weirdly determined not to learn. This is the accidental cult. The year is 1977. It's past midnight on a Friday. The Waverly, a repertory cinema on 6th Avenue in Greenwich Village, New York City. It's not a glamorous venue. It's small. It's slightly sticky. The carpet has opinions. It seats just over 400 people. And tonight, as on most Friday nights now, most of those seats are full. The audience is not dressed for an ordinary trip to the pictures. Suspenders, fishnet stockings, wedding dresses, at least 3 people in rubber gloves. 1 man in a sequined corset who has clearly committed to the bit. A couple near the back are clutching newspapers. Someone near the aisle has a water pistol. It's either the beginning of a cult ritual or the stupidest coup in American history. The lights go down. A pair of disembodied red lips appear on the screen, and they begin to sing about science fiction. Someone in the 3rd row throws a handful of rice. This will happen again next Friday. It's already been happening for more than a year. It will keep happening for another decade. 20th Century Fox released this film in 1975. They had no idea what to do with it. Neither did the critics. It was pulled from theatres within weeks of release, dismissed as a curiosity if it was lucky, a misfire if it wasn't. Fox had moved on. The audience had not. Richard O'Brien was unemployed. It was 1972. He was a New Zealand-born actor living in London, waiting for something to happen. And, like many people in that situation, responded in the most sensible possible way, by inventing a deranged stage musical. It was a love letter to B-movies, old science fiction serials, horror cliches, and the glam rock he adored. At its centre was Frankenfurter, a mad scientist in stockings and pearls. Around him, a tap-dancing criminologist narrator, a lab-grown blonde bimbo named Rocky, and 2 extraordinarily square Americans named Brad and Janet, who wandered into the story like they'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a much duller evening.
Goodness.
O'Brien showed it to director Jim Sharman, who'd recently been directing the Australian production of Hair. Sharman loved it. In June 1973, the Rocky Horror Show opened at the Royal Court Theatre upstairs in London, a fringe space with perhaps 100 seats above the main house. Not the sort of room that usually announces itself as the birthplace of a cultural mutation. It was, almost immediately, a phenomenon. The stage show transferred, it reached the West End, it went to Los Angeles, it won awards. By the time a film adaptation was announced, Rocky Horror had become a genuine theatrical hit, something original, unapologetically strange, and loved with the sort of intensity that normally makes studio executives nervous. 20th Century Fox made the film. They brought back most of the original cast. They brought back Jim Sharman to direct. They did, in a straightforward technical sense, many of the correct things. But the problem was, the stage show had worked precisely because of its physical circumstances. A fringe venue, the size of a living room, performers close enough to touch, an atmosphere somewhere between theatre, seduction, and the distinct possibility that the whole thing might just wobble off its rails. You were in the room with it. You could feel the effort, the sweat, the electricity, the sense that this might, at any moment, become either transcendent or ridiculous, or possibly both at once. The film couldn't offer that. It was projected, distant, fixed on celluloid. The rough live wire quality that made the stage show feel dangerous and exhilarating became on screen something slightly more mannered. Not dead, not bad, but no longer happening to you in the same way. The Rocky Horror Picture Show opened in the United States in September 1975. It was pulled from most theatres within weeks. Reviews ranged from mixed to openly dismissive. The box office was catastrophic. Fox buried it. And this is where the studio's part in the story more or less ends. Which is awkward for them because the story was only just getting started. Two of the film's producers, Lou Adler and Michael White, had not given up on it. They kept licensing it to odd little slots. Midnight screenings, off-peak bookings, the leftover hours where normal programming had finished, the foyers were half empty and the hire was cheap. In 1976, a programmer at the Waverley named Tim Deegan booked it for a regular midnight slot. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He was trying to fill a time slot with something eccentric, inexpensive, and already written off. The first 2 weeks are quiet. But then, something began. Nobody is entirely sure who threw the first newspaper. Which feels appropriate, really. Cults rarely begin with paperwork. What is documented is that at some point during a midnight screening at the Waverley, most accounts place it between 1976 and early 1977, a member of the audience shouted back at the screen. When Janet, caught in the rain, pulls a newspaper over her head, someone in the dark called out,
"Buy an umbrella, you cheap bitch."
The next week, people remembered the line. They called it back themselves.
"Buy an umbrella, you cheap."
After that, someone brought a newspaper. Then someone came dressed as Frankenfurter. Then more people came in costume. Then rice appeared, thrown during the opening wedding sequence. Then water pistols for rain. Then toast, hurled at the screen with the solemn dignity of a religious rite designed by absolute idiots. Then flashlights. Then playing cards thrown during the card game scene. Then lighters raised during the song There's a Light, like the most ridiculous arena concert in human history. None of this was organised. None of it was designed. There was no corporate strategy meeting, no focus group, no miserable brand consultant proposing interactive audience engagement as a growth opportunity. The audience just did it. Week after week, the ritual evolved. People who had done it one week came back and brought friends who hadn't. The friends were initiated. Then they came back and brought their own friends. The thing reproduced itself. Not because anybody had built a system for it, but because people enjoyed being inside it and wanted other people to understand why. By the late 70s, there were audience-led casts performing in front of the screen at certain venues, acting out every scene in real time. Shadow casts, they were called. Amateur performers, sometimes gloriously amateur, sometimes alarmingly committed, showing up every Friday night to perform a film they knew frame by frame. The Waverley ran Rocky Horror at midnight for a decade, continuously. The same film, the same slot, the same audience-built ritual every week for 10 years. And it spread. City by city, cinema by cinema. The ritual mutated as it travelled. Different places developed their own callback traditions, their own variations on the props and the costumes and the tiny ceremonial acts of nonsense. At its peak in the early 1980s, Rocky Horror was playing at midnight in more than 200 theatres across North America every single week. Fox had no part in this. The studio that had abandoned the film was now watching an audience build something it had never known how to manufacture in the first place. But the most important thing that the midnight screenings created was not a ritual. It was a room. Rocky Horror, with its unapologetic queerness, its Frankenfurter who answered to nobody and apologised for nothing, became a gathering point for people who didn't fit in their schools, their towns, their families. For young gay men and queer women in the late 70s and early 80s, at a time when mainstream culture was not exactly rushing to make space for them. For theatre kids, outsiders, anybody living with the daily grind of being told subtly or otherwise that their existence needed correcting. The midnight screenings was a place you could go where the, in quotes, wrong things were the point. The film had not been designed as a sanctuary, but the audience made it one. Because they needed it, and because it was there. That is the mechanism of cult. Not marketing, not design, not studio strategy. Need. Rocky Horror is probably the most vivid example of this cult mechanism. But it's not the only one, and the next story differs in almost every respect. Different decade, different scale, different genre, different kind of failure. Which is useful, because if cult works the same way across that much distance, then the mechanism may actually be telling us something rather than merely being weird in several unrelated directions. In 1982, one of the most influential science fiction films ever made opened, was dismissed, and quietly began its second life. But to understand what happened to the film, you have to understand what Philip K. Dick had spent his career doing. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was published in 1968. Dick spent much of his career writing science fiction that the mainstream publishing world didn't quite know what to do with. He was brilliant, prolific, troubled, and very often broke, selling work for cents per word, living in circumstances that were frequently chaotic, and asking questions that the genre was not always prepared to answer. What makes an experience real, and does it matter who created it? What is humanity, and does it require a continuous memory to be real? Can empathy be synthesized? And if it can, does that make it counterfeit, or simply precious? By the time a film adaptation of his novel was announced in the late 1970s, Dick was not a household name. He was something else. A cult writer, in the precise sense. A serious, devoted readership had found him long before the mainstream noticed, and had already decided that what he was doing mattered. When production began on what would become Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott, starring Harrison Ford, and carrying a budget of around $28 million, Dick was shown an early effects reel, just the visuals, a demonstration of the world Scott was building, rain-slicked streets, neon towers, vast industrial canyons, a city so overgrown it seemed to be crushing the people inside it. Dick wrote to the production company afterwards. What he saw, he said, was what he had spent his career trying to put on the page. It was his vision realised. Philip K. Dick died in March 1982. Blade Runner opened 4 months later. He never saw the finished film. And what he would have made of that finished film is an interesting question. Because by the time it had reached cinemas, it had been significantly altered from the version Ridley Scott had actually made. Test screenings had not gone well. Preview audiences were disorientated. The pace was slow. The mood was thick with philosophical unease. The film refused to explain itself with the cheerful obedience studios generally prefer. Scott had built those qualities on purpose, but the studio experienced them as faults. So they started fixing them. Harrison Ford was brought in to record a voiceover narration, a hard-boiled detective monologue designed to guide audiences through the story. Ford, by several accounts, was deeply unhappy about this requirement. His delivery is famously flat. Less world-weary gumshoe, more man reading ransom instructions under duress. Whether that was a deliberate act of sabotage, a performance pitched to be so obviously wrong that he hoped the studio would be forced to remove it, is something that Ford has never quite answered cleanly. The narration did stay in. The studio also demanded a happy ending. The studio version ends with Deckard and Rachel driving off together through green hills under open skies. The footage was reportedly aerial landscape material originally shot by Stanley Kubrick for The Shining. Kubrick no longer needed it, so Scott repurposed it. So a film about manufactured memory and simulated authenticity was given a happy ending assembled from somebody else's leftover dream. The irony is either very funny or very grim, depending on your mood. Blade Runner opened in June 1982. It opened against E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which had arrived 2 weeks earlier and was in the middle of becoming one of the biggest hits in cinema history. On a budget of around $28 million, Blade Runner made roughly $27 million domestically. Reviews were mixed, the studio filed it under did not work and moved on. But then, home video happened. Blade Runner found cable television and the VHS market in the mid-1980s, and something quiet began. People started watching it, and then watching it again, and again, and again, realizing the film had not finished with them the first time. Is Deckard a replicant? That question became the center of gravity. In Scott's original conception, yes. In the theatrical version released to cinema, the answer is obscured. There's a scene, removed from the theatrical cut, in which Deckard dreams of a unicorn running through a forest. Briefly, silently. It feels less like plot than intrusion. Later, near the end of the film, Gaff leaves an origami unicorn outside Deckard's apartment. And in the context of the dream, the implication is horrible. Someone knows what Deckard dreams, which means, within the logic of the film, those dreams may not be dreams at all. They may be implants, manufactured memories, a private interior life that's not private and may not even be his. Which means Deckard is not merely hunting artificial people, he may be one. Without the unicorn dream, the origami figure is ambiguous. With it, the ending changes shape entirely. It's no longer a love story with a strange aftertaste. It's something colder and more destabilizing. Two manufactured people walking into a world that will hunt them both. And once people noticed that, they did what cult audiences do. They kept digging. Different prints began to circulate. Bootlegs moved from hand to hand. Versions without the narration, versions with alternate cuts, partial versions, rumoured versions. The question of what Blade Runner really is, what it meant, what Ridley Scott had intended before the studio panicked, became a sustained cultural argument. Not a mass argument, not yet, a niche one. The kind that happens in science fiction circles, in film criticism, in specialist magazines, in university screenings, in all those corners of culture where people care about something far too much to leave it alone. By the early 1990s, unofficial director's cuts were circulating widely enough that Warner Brothers arrived at the most studio solution imaginable. If people insist on chasing bootlegs, sell them a sanctioned version of the bootleg. So in 1992, a director's cut was released. It wasn't fully assembled by Scott himself, but by archivist Michael Arick, with Scott consulting on approvals. Even so, it changed the film decisively. The voiceover was gone. The unicorn dream was back. The happy ending disappeared. The film ended once again on ambiguity, dread, and the suspicion that identity itself might be a corporate product. Scott did later express dissatisfaction with parts of the release. So in 2007, for the 25th anniversary, he released the final cut, the first version of Blade Runner over which he had complete creative control. But there are now, depending on how you count them, at least 7 distinct versions of Blade Runner. 7. No film with a smooth, uncontested, institutionally approved production history has 7 versions. 7 versions is what you get when a film is wounded on release, argued over decades, and slowly excavated by people who refuse to accept the first official answer. The multiplicity is part of the text, the studio interference, the preview screening panic, the forced narration, the borrowed happy ending. All of that chaos created a film that people could spend decades arguing about because the definitive version had not fully existed until 25 years after the original release. And whilst all that was happening, the ideas inside the film only became more potent. The neon corporate dystopia that looked baroque and excessive in 1982 began by the 1990s and 2000s to feel less like fantasy and more like an unpleasant forecast. The questions about memory, identity, authenticity, and corporate control of human experience, the questions Philip K. Dick had spent his career worrying about, aged from science fiction into something much disturbingly closer to news. Blade Runner is now regarded as one of the greatest science fiction films ever made. It shaped the visual language of urban science fiction for more than 40 years. If you've seen a rain-slicked neon city in a film or a video game, a music video, or a piece of concept art at any point in the last 4 decades, you're looking at Blade Runner's shadow. And it took a studio failure, an obsessive, argumentative audience, and decades of slow cultural accumulation to get there. Blade Runner took decades to become what it became. Rocky Horror took years. The third film in this story moves faster, which makes it in some ways the strangest case of all. The distance between commercial disappointment and beloved institution was so short and covered so quietly that the industry barely seemed to notice it happen until it was already enshrined. Joel and Ethan Coen had, by 1997, made Fargo. Fargo won 2 Academy Awards. It was critically adored, commercially successful, and had confirmed the Coens as 2 of the most distinctive filmmakers in American cinema. Expectations for whatever came next were, in the technical industry term, not small. What did come next was a film about an unemployed man in Los Angeles who goes bowling, drinks White Russians, and he's dragged, against his will and against his skill set, into a kidnapping plot he is comically unequipped to understand. The Big Lebowski drew on 2 main sources. The first was Raymond Chandler, specifically the structured logic of The Big Sleep, a novel the Coens admired in part because its plot is famously and perhaps almost aggressively incoherent. Philip Marlowe investigates. Things happen, people lie, new people appear, nothing fully resolves, and somehow it still works because the atmosphere and the characters are more satisfying than clarity would have been. The Coens found this encouraging. The second source was Jeff Dowd, a film producer they knew in Los Angeles, a man of immense calm, unusual work habits, and the nickname The Dude. He seemed to have achieved a kind of philosophical détente with the universe that most people spend their lives attempting and failing to negotiate. The film was released in March 1998. It made about $70 million domestically on a budget of roughly $15 million. Technically not a disaster, but in the long shadow of Fargo, plainly treated as a disappointment. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars and seemed genuinely unsure what to do with it. The general consensus was amusing, perhaps minor Coens, perhaps not essential. The Coens moved on, and the film drifted into cable television, video rental shops, and the informal bloodstream of cultural transmission. The friend who insists you borrow this VHS, the late-night channel stumble, the half-seen scene that makes you go back and find the rest. The Big Lebowski is not a film that explains itself on first viewing. Its pleasures are not primarily structural. The plot does not become clearer when you watch it again. If anything, it becomes more gloriously unhelpful. What becomes clearer is something else. The rhythm of the dialogue, the absolute precision of the performances, the texture of the world, the way the film commits so fully to its own wavelength that eventually you either tune in or you don't. And if you do tune in, you tend to stay there. It's a film people start quoting before they have fully processed it, and quoting it becomes the way of locating other people who are also living, at least intermittently, inside its very own specific frequency. The Dude Abides appeared on t-shirts. This aggression will not stand, man, enters the vocabulary of a certain generation. That rug really tied the room together, became shorthand for a whole category of petty but deeply felt grievance. the small indignity that somehow comes to represent everything else that is wrong with the world. In 2002, 4 years after the film's release, two friends in Louisville, Kentucky, Will Russell and Scott Shuffett, organised an event. They call it Lebowski Fest. They held it in a bowling alley, because of course they did. People arrived dressed as their favourite characters. They bowled, they drank White Russians. They watched the film, which is honestly about as inevitable a sequence of events as American culture has ever produced. But Lebowski Fest grew. It spread to New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, even London. And then, because the internet exists and fandom has a remarkable gift for turning jokes into infrastructure, someone founded a religion. Dudism. Formerly named the Church of the Latter-day Dude, it comes complete with ordained ministers, an online seminary, and a philosophy built around the accidental wisdom of a man whose defining principle is that he would rather not deal with this right now. Jeff Bridges has attended Lebowski Fests. He's been gracious about it. He's also admitted that he doesn't entirely understand how any of this happened. The Coens have said much the same. They made a film they liked about a character who amused them, and the rest is not their doing. That's the honest truth of accidental cult filmmaking. You can't engineer it. You can't focus group the dude into existence. You can't reverse engineer a worldview people want to inhabit. You can only make something genuine, release it into the world, and then watch, slightly baffled, as other people decide it belongs to them. 3 films, 3 decades. 3 wildly different genres, tones, budgets, and creative conditions. Rocky Horror is a glam rock horror comedy musical made for a fraction of what Hollywood considers serious money. Blade Runner is a $28 million neo-noir science fiction film with major stars, a major director, and a studio nervous breakdown built into its release history. The Big Lebowski is a post-Fargo Coen Brothers film arriving with prestige, expectations, and actually no intention of behaving itself. What they share isn't style, not scale, not even audience. What they share is structure. All 3 films underperformed on release. All 3 were, in the eyes of the institutions that made them, effectively finished, filed under did not work, moved past, replaced by the next project, the next quarter, the next thing expected to behave itself. But audiences are not institutions. Audiences don't always move at the speed of opening weekends, quarterly reports, or panic studio notes. These films found their real lives through channels the studios hadn't designed. Midnight screenings, cables, VHS, rental shops, word of mouth, and the old informal distribution network known as that one person turning to another saying, "You need to see this strange thing." And what they created was not merely an audience, it was a community. That distinction matters. An audience watches. A community gathers, returns, argues, dresses up, quotes lines at each other, writes essays, develops rituals, brings friends, initiates them, and keeps showing up long after the people who have financed the thing stopped caring. An audience disperses when the credits roll. A community persists. It recruits, and in at least one case, it acquires clergy. But in all 3 examples, the commercial failure was not incidental in the cult status. It was part of the mechanism. A hit belongs to everyone, and no one in particular. It becomes the mainstream, and the mainstream, by definition, has no edges. Cult objects belong fiercely to specific people with specific needs, because those people found them in the margins. Not because a marketing campaign instructed them to, not because a studio manufactured urgency, but because something in the work answered a question they were already asking. Rocky Horror's strangeness, its celebration of theatricality, queerness, and the glorious refusal to apologise for itself, made it difficult to market to a mainstream audience in 1975. That same quality made it vital to people who needed it. If Fox had known how to sell it broadly, there's every chance they would also have known how to blunt the very edges that made it matter. Blade Runner's difficulty did something similar. Its slow pace, ambiguity, damaged release history, and unresolved questions created the intellectual space where decades of obsession could thrive. A clean, universally approved, instantly legible Blade Runner might have been admired and then gently shelved. The broken one became inexhaustible. And The Big Lebowski benefited from a different kind of neglect. Its modest commercial status left it alone. It arrived without saturation, without the cultural command that everybody must see it right now, without the flattening effect of total ubiquity. The people who found it felt like they'd found it themselves. That matters. Discovery matters. Recognition matters. The feeling of this is mine is very hard to manufacture at a blockbuster scale. And that's the strange generosity of failure. It leaves space. Space for audiences to approach on their own terms. Space for meanings to gather, slowly. Space for a film to stop being a product and become a shared object. Something passed between people. Something explained badly at parties. Something pressed into a friend's hand with the dangerous sentence, "Trust me." There's something moving about that. Philip K. Dick spent his career writing books the mainstream mostly ignored. He died 4 months before Blade Runner opened, never knowing that the film adaptation of his work would one day be treated as a science fiction landmark. Richard O'Brien wrote a musical while unemployed because he wanted to celebrate the disreputable things that he loved. B-movies, old horror, science fiction serials, glam rock, sexual diversity, and the simple joy of being spectacularly too much. He had no way of knowing it would become a rite of passage for generations of outsiders. The Coens made a film about a man whose defining trait is deeply resistant to unnecessary effort because they found him funny. They had no way of knowing it would become somehow a minor spiritual authority. And the studios, in all 3 cases, had their chance. Fox had Rocky Horror, Warner had Blade Runner, Polygram and Universal had The Big Lebowski. They had these things in their hands, looked at the numbers and moved on. The audience didn't, and then they held on. They made rituals out of them, built conversations around them, decided collectively and without permission that these things were worth keeping. Rocky Horror still has midnight screenings. Blade Runner still has people staring at one unicorn and refusing to calm down. The dude is still abiding. The audience became a community. That, in the end, is the story. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. Next episode, we will bring Season 2 to a close. It's a coda to everything we've been building towards. You can find more of Geektown and all the stuff we do over at geektown.co.uk, including Geektown Radio, our weekly show that brings you all the latest TV, film and gaming news. And if you've been enjoying Geekstorians, leave us a review wherever you listen. That really does help other people find the show. Until next time, some things are too strange to die.